Rain poured relentlessly the night a desperate single father opened his door to a shivering stranger. He gave up his only hot meal to save her, completely unaware that this ragged, homeless woman secretly held the power to destroy or salvage his entire livelihood just 3 days later. David Miller shoved his bare hands deep into the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, leaning his weight against the brutal November wind. Chicago winters never asked for permission before they arrived, and tonight a freak ice storm was tearing through the city's south side. He was exhausted after an agonizing 9-hour shift crunching data at Sterling Mutual, a mid-level financial firm that treated its employees like disposable batteries. David had spent another 3 hours driving a rideshare just to afford groceries for the week. At 32, David was a widower. The tragic loss of his wife, Sarah, to a sudden aneurysm 2 years prior had shattered his world and left him to raise their 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, entirely alone. Worse, the medical bills had drained their savings, leaving him drowning in debt and teetering dangerously close to eviction. As he hurried down the darkened alley behind his decaying apartment complex, the flickering amber glow of a broken street lamp caught something unusual. Tucked away beside the frozen, overflowing industrial dumpsters was a lump of grey fabric. David stopped. The temperature was dropping below zero, and the ice was beginning to sheet over the concrete. He took a cautious step closer. The fabric moved. It was a person. "Hey!" David called out over the howling wind, stepping closer. "You can't sleep here. You'll freeze to death before sunrise." The figure flinched, pulling the torn, mud-stained coat tighter. As David knelt, he saw a woman. Her face was smeared with dark soot and dried blood from a nasty gash above her left eyebrow. Her lips were blue, trembling violently, and her eyes, a striking, piercing shade of hazel, were wide with a mix of exhaustion and absolute terror. She looked to be in her early 30s, but the sheer misery etched into her features made it impossible to tell. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped. She clutched her side, shivering uncontrollably. David looked around the empty, freezing alley. He knew the homeless shelters downtown were operating at maximum capacity. He had driven past lines of desperate people wrapping around the block earlier that evening. He thought about his tiny, cramped apartment on the 3rd floor. He thought about the stack of past-due bills sitting on his kitchen counter. He had barely enough to keep his own head above water. Inviting a stranger into his home was dangerous, financially reckless, and utterly absurd. But as he looked down into the woman's terrified eyes, he thought of Chloe. He thought of the kind of world he wanted to raise his daughter in. "Come on," David said firmly, reaching down and offering his hand. "You're coming with me." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting suspiciously, but the biting wind ripped through her soaked clothing, making the decision for her. She took his hand. Her fingers were like ice. It took them 10 minutes to navigate the 3 flights of stairs. When David finally unlocked the door to Unit 3B, the blast of warm air from the radiator hit them like a physical force. "Daddy!" Chloe's bright voice echoed from the tiny living room. She ran over, wearing oversized flannel pajamas, but stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the woman dripping melting ice onto the cheap linoleum floor. "It's okay, sweetie," David reassured his daughter, locking the deadbolt behind them. "This lady got caught in the bad storm outside. She's going to warm up here for a little bit." The woman stood frozen by the door, dripping wet, looking around the apartment. It was painfully small and sparsely furnished, but it was immaculately clean. A framed photograph of David, Sarah, and a baby Chloe sat proudly on the television stand. "Bathroom is right down the hall," David said softly, grabbing a stack of clean towels from a nearby closet. "Take a hot shower. I'll find some of my wife's old clothes for you." They should fit. The woman accepted the towels with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely a scratch in her throat. Over the next hour, David moved with quiet efficiency. He found a pair of clean sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie. He heated up a can of chicken noodle soup on the rusty stove. It was supposed to be his dinner, but he quietly poured the entire can into a ceramic bowl and set it on the small kitchen table. He would settle for a piece of toast. When the woman emerged, she looked entirely different. The mud and grime were gone. Though a deep purple bruise marred her cheekbone and the cut on her forehead looked painful, there was a sharp, striking elegance to her features that the dirt had hidden. She moved with an odd, measured grace, even while drowning in oversized cotton. She sat at the table and stared at the steaming bowl of soup as if it were made of solid gold. "Eat," David encouraged, sitting across from her with a mug of black tea. "I'm David. This is Chloe." "Anna," the woman replied softly, after a long pause. She took a slow spoonful of the broth, closing her eyes as the warmth hit her stomach. "You shouldn't have brought me in. I could be anyone." "You were a human being freezing to death in an alley," David replied simply. "That's all I needed to know." Anna's gaze drifted across the room. Her sharp eyes landed on the kitchen counter, where a bright red final notice envelope rested prominently atop a stack of utility bills. Next to it was a calculator and a notepad filled with desperate, frantic budgeting math. She then looked at David's plate, containing nothing but a single slice of dry, burnt toast. "You don't have much," Anna noted. Her voice had lost a bit of its raspy edge, revealing a tone that was strangely polished, almost commanding, despite her fragile state. "We have enough." David smiled, though the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed him. "We have a roof. We have heat. And tonight, so do you." Chloe walked over, clutching a faded teddy bear. Without a word, she held the bear out to Anna. "Mr. Barnaby says you can hold him if you're scared. He keeps the monsters away." A strange, unfamiliar emotion flashed across Anna's face. For a split second, the hardened exterior of a woman who had seen the absolute worst of the world seemed to crack. She gently reached out and took the bear, a single tear slipping down her bruised cheek. "Thank you, Chloe. Mr. Barnaby is very brave." David set up the futon in the living room with heavy blankets. He offered Anna the makeshift bed, wishing her a good night. As he closed his bedroom door, he felt a strange sense of unease mixed with relief. He didn't know who Anna was, but he knew he had done the right thing. Outside, the storm raged on, completely indifferent to the tiny spark of humanity burning brightly inside Unit 3B. When David's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m. the next morning, the apartment was deathly quiet. He threw off his covers and walked out into the living room. The futon was empty. The blankets had been folded into a precise, mathematically perfect square and placed at the end of the mattress. The borrowed clothes were neatly stacked on the coffee table. Anna was gone. David checked the front door. It had been unlocked from the inside. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his messy hair. Part of him was relieved she hadn't stolen his television, though there wasn't much of value to take anyway. He walked into the kitchen to start the coffee maker and noticed a small, folded paper napkin resting over his stack of unpaid bills. Written on the napkin, in surprisingly elegant, looping handwriting, using one of his cheap ballpoint pens, were exactly 5 words. "Thank you for the warmth." He stared at the note for a long moment, folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He had to get Chloe ready for school. There was no time to dwell on ghosts. 72 hours later, David's act of kindness was the furthest thing from his mind. His reality was crashing down around him. Sterling Mutual was in a state of absolute, sheer panic. For months, rumors of a massive corporate buyout had paralyzed the office. The parent company, a ruthless global conglomerate known as Sinclair Holdings, had officially finalized the acquisition. Sinclair Holdings was notorious on Wall Street for buying struggling financial firms, gutting their staff by 80%, and liquidating the assets. Today was Friday, the day of the audit. The entire 12th floor was buzzing with terrified whispers. Employees were aggressively deleting personal emails, organizing their cubicles, and bracing for the worst. "They say she's a shark," whispered Mark, a fellow analyst, leaning over the frosted glass of David's cubicle. Audrey Sinclair. The CEO herself is flying in from New York to handle the restructuring. She doesn't send middle management. She comes down with an axe and chops the heads off the underperformers herself. "I just need to keep my head down," David replied, furiously typing numbers into a spreadsheet. "If I lose this job, Mark, I lose the apartment. I have nothing in savings. I can't get fired today." "Well, you better watch your back," Mark warned, nodding toward the corner office. "Because Caldwell is looking for a sacrificial lamb." Richard Caldwell, the branch manager of the Chicago office, was a notoriously arrogant and incompetent boss. He survived corporate purges by stealing credit for his subordinates' successes and violently blaming them for his own failures. As the Sinclair audit loomed, Caldwell's department was showing a massive $3 million deficit, a deficit entirely caused by Caldwell's reckless real estate investments the previous quarter. At 10 a.m. sharp, the elevators chimed. A team of men and women in impeccably tailored dark suits marched onto the floor. They moved with military precision. The chatter on the floor died instantly. The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. "Everyone gather in the main boardroom," Caldwell barked, his face flushed red, sweat beading on his receding hairline. He was desperately trying to project authority, but his voice cracked slightly. "Now, move it." David joined the herd of anxious employees filing into the massive glass-walled conference room. The long mahogany table had been cleared. Standing at the head of the room were the Sinclair executives, their faces unreadable. But the CEO was not yet in the room. Caldwell stood near the projector screen, clearing his throat. He spotted David in the back row, and a cruel, desperate smile crossed his face. He pointed a trembling finger directly at him. "Miller, get up here!" Caldwell commanded loudly. The room went dead silent. David's stomach plummeted. He felt 70 pairs of eyes burn into his back. His legs felt like lead as he slowly walked toward the front of the boardroom. "Let's get something straight before Ms. Sinclair arrives," Caldwell announced to the room, though his eyes darted nervously toward the hallway. "This branch has struggled. We've missed our quarterly targets, but I want it on the record that this management team has identified the cancerous elements within our structure." Caldwell turned to David, stepping into his personal space. David Miller was in charge of the Q3 risk assessment. Caldwell lied smoothly, his voice echoing in the silent room. His catastrophic miscalculations cost this branch millions. "I am formally terminating your employment, David, effective immediately, for gross negligence." David felt the blood drain from his face. "What? Richard, you signed off on the Q3 reports yourself. You altered the risk parameters." "Security!" Caldwell shouted, cutting him off, desperate to silence him before the CEO walked in. "Escort Mr. Miller out. He is completely unhinged." Two large security guards in the back of the room stepped forward. David felt his chest tighten. He thought of the eviction notice on his counter. He thought of Chloe's face. He was being framed to save Caldwell's high-paying salary, and there was absolutely nothing he could do. Suddenly, The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. "That won't be necessary," a voice echoed through the room. The voice was calm, polished, and carried a dangerous authority that demanded absolute obedience. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Striding into the boardroom was Audrey Sinclair, the billionaire CEO of Sinclair Holdings. She wore a sharply tailored, charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit that screamed power. Her posture was flawless, her expression completely unreadable. Flanked by her executive assistants, she walked slowly toward the head of the table. David froze. His breath caught in his throat. The mud was gone. The bruises were covered by flawless makeup, save for a small, faint butterfly bandage resting just above her left eyebrow. The oversized hoodie and sweatpants had been replaced by thousands of dollars of silk and wool, but the striking hazel eyes were exactly the same. It was Anna, the woman he had pulled from the frozen alley, the woman who had slept on his cheap futon and clutched his daughter's worn-out teddy bear. Audrey Sinclair stepped up to the front of the room. She didn't look at the executives. She didn't look at Caldwell, who was practically bowing in her presence. Her piercing hazel eyes locked directly onto David Miller. For 10 agonizing seconds, the billionaire CEO and the desperate single father stared at each other in absolute silence. No one in the boardroom dared to breathe. David's mind raced, completely short-circuiting. How was this possible? Was it a trap? A test? "Ms. Sinclair," Caldwell practically groveled, stepping forward and wiping sweat from his brow. "Welcome to Chicago. I was just taking out the trash, as it were. This is David Miller, the analyst responsible for our deficit. I've just terminated him." Audrey finally broke eye contact with David and slowly turned her gaze to Caldwell. Her expression shifted from neutral to something utterly terrifying. "Is that so, Mr. Caldwell?" Audrey asked, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "Yes, ma'am. Completely useless employee. A drain on company resources," Caldwell pushed, thinking he was gaining her favor. Audrey calmly unbuttoned her suit jacket, took a seat at the head of the table, and rested her hands lightly on the mahogany wood. She looked back up at David, a microscopic smirk playing at the corner of her lips, a secret shared between two people in a room full of blind men. "Fascinating," Audrey said softly, her eyes never leaving David's. "Because according to my private audit, David Miller is the only asset in this entire building worth saving." The boardroom was so quiet that the hum of the overhead vents sounded like a jet engine. Richard Caldwell's face drained of color, transforming from an angry, flushed red to a sickly, translucent white. He let out a nervous, breathless chuckle, looking around the room as if waiting for a punchline that would never come. I beg your pardon, Miss Sinclair," Caldwell stammered, the arrogant bravado entirely stripped from his voice. "I don't think I understand. Miller is a low-level analyst. The Q3 reports clearly show his algorithms failed." Audrey Sinclair did not blink. She leaned back in her chair, a portrait of absolute, chilling control. She raised 2 fingers, signaling her chief executive assistant, a tall, imposing man named Gregory. Without a word, Gregory opened a leather briefcase, retrieved a thick, heavily redacted dossier, and slid it down the mahogany table. It stopped precisely in front of Caldwell. "That is a forensic financial audit," Audrey stated, her voice echoing with lethal precision. "Conducted not by your compromised internal team, but by an independent firm I hired 3 months ago. You see, Richard, I don't blindly gut companies. I investigate them. And my investigation revealed that the $3 million deficit wasn't a mathematical error." Audrey stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she began to slowly circle the massive table. "It was embezzlement," she continued, locking eyes with the terrified executives who suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting. Specifically, $3.2 million siphoned through phantom real estate acquisitions and wired into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation owned by your brother-in-law, Mr. Caldwell. A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. Mark, the analyst who had warned David earlier, gripped the edge of his chair, his jaw practically on the floor. "Ms. Sinclair, this is absurd. Those are fabricated documents," Caldwell shouted, a shrill panic gripping his throat. He backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. "I am the branch director. I demand to know who fed you these lies." "I found out myself," Audrey replied coldly. 3 days ago, I flew into Chicago a week ahead of schedule, completely off the books. I bypassed my security detail and my corporate driver. I came here to secretly meet with a whistleblower who had promised to hand over the physical ledgers proving your theft. David's breath caught in his chest. The pieces were suddenly snapping together with terrifying clarity. "But you found out about the meeting, didn't you, Richard?" Audrey's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as she stopped right beside Caldwell. "You panicked. You hired 2 private fixers to intercept the whistleblower. Only, they intercepted me instead." The silence in the room was suffocating. Caldwell began to tremble violently, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what he had done. "They corners me outside the Drake Hotel," Audrey said, her gaze flickering briefly toward David, softening for a fraction of a second before returning to Caldwell with lethal intensity. "They stole my briefcase, my phone, and my identification. When I fought back, they threw me into a brick wall, leaving me bleeding and unconscious in a freezing alley on the south side. They assumed I was just some anonymous corporate drone. They left me to freeze to death to protect your little slush fund." Caldwell fell back into his chair, gasping for air as if the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. "You didn't just steal from my company, Richard," Audrey whispered, leaning down so her face was inches from his. "You orchestrated an assault on its CEO." I didn't know it was you," Caldwell sobbed, completely breaking down, unknowingly confessing to the entire crime in front of 70 witnesses. "I swear, I just told them to scare the auditor. I didn't tell them to hurt anyone." Audrey straightened her posture, disgusted. "Gregory," she called out calmly. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open again. This time, 2 uniformed Chicago police detectives stepped into the room, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Richard Caldwell, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault," one of the detectives announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Caldwell didn't even put up a fight. He sobbed uncontrollably as the detectives hauled him out of his chair, snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, and marched him out of the boardroom. The entire 12th floor watched in stunned, paralyzed silence as the tyrant who had tormented them for years was paraded out like a common criminal. Audrey stood at the head of the table, smoothing the lapels of her suit jacket. She looked out at the terrified sea of analysts and managers. "The restructuring of this branch begins today," Audrey announced, her authoritative voice filling the room. "Any employee involved in Caldwell's scheme will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The rest of you will return to your desks. We have a company to rebuild." The executives practically trampled each other to exit the boardroom, desperate to escape the CEO's wrath. Within 30 seconds, the massive room was entirely empty, except for 2 people. David stood frozen near the projector screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Audrey remained at the head of the table, the ruthless, terrifying billionaire shark who had just decimated a man's life dissolved, and for a fleeting moment, She was simply Anna again. "Take a seat, David," she said softly, gesturing to the chair closest to her. David slowly walked over and sat down, feeling completely out of his depth. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. The butterfly bandage above her eyebrow suddenly made perfect sense. "Anna?" David asked tentatively, still trying to process the whiplash of the last 10 minutes. Audrey smiled, a genuine warm expression that had been entirely absent during the corporate execution she had just performed. "Audrey Anna Sinclair. My mother always called me Anna. It felt like the safest name to use when I woke up in a stranger's apartment." You own all of this," David managed to say, gesturing broadly to the sprawling corporate office. "You're a billionaire. Why didn't you just tell me? I could have taken you to a hospital or called the police. When I woke up in that alley, I had a severe concussion," Audrey explained, her hazel eyes turning incredibly serious. "I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know how deep Caldwell's corruption went in this city, or if the police were on his payroll. All I knew was that I was freezing to death, and my empire, my billions of dollars, my private jets, none of it meant absolutely anything. I was just a dying woman in the cold." She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "Then a man walking home from a grueling double shift stopped in the ice," Audrey continued, her voice thick with emotion. "A man drowning in debt, raising a daughter alone, gave me his only hot meal. You didn't ask for my name, my resume, or my bank account balance. You just saw someone in pain and chose to heal them." David looked down at his hands. "It was just a can of soup and a warm radiator." "It was my life," Audrey corrected him fiercely. "When I slipped out before dawn, I walked to a 24-hour diner, used their landline to call Gregory, and had my security team extract me. I spent the last 3 days recovering and tearing Caldwell's life apart. But I also spent those days looking into yours." David tensed slightly. "You are a brilliant analyst, David," Audrey said, sliding a polished leather folder across the table. "You flagged the discrepancies in Caldwell's real estate portfolio 6 months ago. He buried your reports and threatened to fire you to keep you quiet. You have integrity. And in my industry, loyalty and integrity are the only currencies that actually matter." David opened the folder. Inside was an employment contract printed on heavy, watermarked paper. "I am officially promoting you to managing director of the Chicago branch," Audrey stated. "Your starting salary is $450,000 a year. Furthermore, Sinclair Holdings is providing you with a signing bonus of $50,000 deposited into your account this afternoon. Pay off your debts. Move Chloe into a neighborhood with a backyard." David stared at the numbers on the page, his vision blurred with tears. The crushing weight of the past 2 years, the medical bills, the eviction notices, the constant suffocating fear of failing his daughter, evaporated in a single instant. "Audrey, I don't know what to say. I can't accept this," David stammered, wiping his eyes. "It's not charity, David," Audrey said firmly. "It's an investment. I need someone leading this branch who actually understands the value of human life. Sign the paper." With trembling hands, David picked up the gold-plated pen resting on the table and signed his name. A week later, the brutal Chicago winter finally broke, giving way to a crisp, bright weekend. David stood in the living room of a spacious, sunlit townhouse in the suburbs, watching movers carry boxes through the front door. The red final notice envelopes were gone forever. A sleek black town car pulled into the driveway. Audrey Sinclair stepped out, wearing a casual beige trench coat, looking far more relaxed than she had in the boardroom. She walked up the driveway, holding a beautifully wrapped gift box. Chloe, wearing her favorite overalls, ran out the front door. "Anna!" she cheered, remembering the kind lady from the storm. Audrey knelt down on the pavement, ignoring the dirt that brushed against her expensive coat. "Hello, Chloe," she smiled brightly. She handed the little girl the box. "I brought back a friend of yours." Chloe tore open the wrapping paper. Inside was Mr. Barnaby, the faded teddy bear. But he was no longer just a worn-out toy. He was wearing a custom-made, tiny pilot's jacket with a little gold badge pinned to the collar. "Mr. Barnaby kept me very safe," Audrey told the little girl seriously. "He fought off all the monsters, so I made him a captain." Chloe beamed, hugging the bear tightly to her chest. Audrey stood up, turning to face David, who was watching from the porch with a profound sense of peace. "I'm flying back to New York tonight," Audrey said, stepping up to the porch. "But before I leave, I wanted to tell you one last thing. Sinclair Holdings has just endowed a new charitable foundation. It's called the Sarah Miller Trust. It will completely cover the medical debt for single parents undergoing emergency trauma care in the state of Illinois." David's breath hitched, hearing his late wife's name attached to something so beautiful, so life-changing, broke the final dam of his emotions. Tears streamed freely down his face. "Thank you," David whispered, pulling the billionaire CEO into a tight, genuine hug. Audrey hugged him back, closing her eyes. In the cutthroat world of corporate warfare, she had built an empire of ice and steel. But it took a struggling single father and a freezing alleyway to remind her that the greatest returns on investment always come from the heart. Did this incredible story of kindness and karma touch your heart? Sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can change your entire destiny. If you loved this real-life drama, please hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that good people still exist. And subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories.